Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage international journalist and broadcaster, Ms. Brigitte Scheffer, and her panelists.
Good midday at this point. Good to see you all still in the room. We are going to kick straight off into the next session, which is the sky's the limit, and how infrastructure investments will reinvent communities and turbocharge the global economy. That's the great question. With me, I have a great panel to discuss infrastructure. I will start from here. This is Mr. Darren Davis, the President and CEO of Ma'aden here in Saudi Arabia. Next to him is Mr. Yong-Hoon Lee, President and CEO of POSCO in South Korea. Next to him is Mr. Ben Way, CEO of Macquarie Group Asia in Australia. Followed by Mr. Tian Wang, he's the general manager and board member of Sinosteel Engineering and Technology in China. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Yusuf Ali, who is he has several titles, chairman and managing director of Lulu Group International, whose headquarters are in Abu Dhabi. Thank you very much, and thank you for your patience as well. So, to launch straight into it, I'm going to start with you, Ben, if that's okay. We were mentioning these ambitious projects, but the truth is, for that you need money. The estimates are at the moment that you need about $50 trillion to meet infrastructure needs. Now, where are you going to get that money from in order to satisfy that demand?
Yeah. I think that's the number one question facing the world, to be honest. At the moment, we're seeing the largest migration of humans in history, which what that is manifesting itself is really people moving into cities, and we're seeing rapid urbanization. That's a good thing because we know cities really drive innovation and entrepreneurialism because you have the density of ideas with the density of capital. And that's been a big springboard for economic growth over the last 100 years, whether it be in the US, whether it be in Korea or China, or whether it be in the Middle East. The real challenge I think the world is facing today is that, as you say, by 2035, the world needs $50 trillion, and more than 55% of that is in Asia, to enable this ongoing urbanization to occur and to ensure that cities have the fundamental building blocks to allow that urbanization to occur and to keep driving economic development. The fundamental point is that there's no institutional government in the world in a single market that has the balance sheet that's able to fund that. The way the world is going to have to fund that is through multiple sources. It will be through multilateral organizations, it will be through corporates, it will obviously be through governments and the public markets, but it will also be through institutional investors. And so the challenge we've got to ensure that we can deal with the needs of urbanization, to combat climate change, to deal with growing inequalities of wealth, is that we need capital to enable us to allow that urbanization and infrastructure build out to occur. And I think it was mentioned in the previous panel, but there are a number of ways we can do that. The first way is probably through much more aggressive privatization programs around the world. Privatization programs are difficult, often because of the political implications in the market they're going to occur, but they're hugely necessary if we're going to see a recycling of assets and a building out of government's balance sheet so that they can really reinvest that capital that they receive from those privatization programs to be successful. The good news is we're starting to see that in a number of markets. We've got, for the first time, quite ambitious privatization programs in countries like Japan, like India. We've seen a big wave of privatizations in markets like Australia, and obviously we're seeing that those plans being put in place in Saudi Arabia through the 2030 vision. So there is some good signs around the world, particularly in G20 economies, that privatization is back on the agenda and that's necessary. The second part of it is going to be much more transparent PPP programs. And those PPP programs are necessary because that's what will catalyse institutional capital, which we know there's an enormous amount of it looking to be deployed, to feel that it can go and partner with government where there's appropriate risk sharing. And so I think if we can put those two building blocks in place, in not just the G20 economies, but around the world where there are lots of markets where very good assets are being built or need to be built, then we can start to see a much better flow of capital from the institutional market in particular into those sorts of projects and programs.
Thank you. Mr. Lee, I wanted to ask you then, because we were talking about this partnership as well, what partnerships between business and government are the most innovative, in your opinion?
As you all aware very well, now the PPP, private-public partnership, has been becoming a very prevailing and highly effective types of partnership to implement massive infrastructure investments. And the role and responsibility of each partners has changed continuously, and I'm going to add 3 ideas which will help this partnership more innovative. One is regarding the public partners, such as central and local government. My experience in construction business makes me realize that every construction project starts from massive destruction of land and rivers and forests, so on. This process inevitably causes serious social problems. Even the construction of roads and railways on the empty land cause environmental issues because of destroying ecological system. These kind of social issues cannot be solved by private partners, such as construction companies and financial investors properly. So from the beginning stages of planning, all 3 parties, including public and private, share these ideas and cooperate to deal with this process properly is very important. Secondly, the public-private partners like construction companies like me should take very proactive and agile stance to develop the construction technologies deriving from fourth industrial revolutions, such as 5-dimension design skills, measuring the land using drones, and increasing the portion of prefabrication, and efficient control of construction period and operation by using the IoT technologies is a best example. And public partners like the government will help and support these efforts through deregulation measures. Last thing is the financial investors. Last year in Korea, very unprecedented event happened. In the bid for high-speed subway system costing around $3 billion, the consortium led by Korean banking group, private banking group, won the bid against Hyundai Construction, which is the #1 construction company in Korea. Now the private financial institutions are very actively venturing out from their comfort zone of simple financial intermediaries like providing loans. So I think, and they are establishing very profound understanding of a whole life scale of infrastructure investment. So the private financial institutions, along with multilateral development banks, should be properly regarded as partners of PPP scheme That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to jump to you, Mr. Ali, at the end there. Coming from a completely different industry, you're one of the largest retailers in the region. So what is your opinion on infrastructure and investment? How would you do it?
First of all, let me thank FII Public Investment for arranging such a huge and professional investment meet across the people, professionals across the world is attending here. Thank you very much, first of all. Let me, my perspective as a retailer. I'm not talking about roads, bridges, rail, or airport. There's all professionals here. Let me talk about my industry, what infrastructure we require. We need accessibility to our retail sectors, of course, but also we need the environment, like visionary leadership, strong economy, and also strong workforce, and accessibility to the common people. Now, I'm since 45 years in this region, in Saudi Arabia also. Now we have got few very promising and also strong visionary leadership in Saudi Arabia, and also strong economy in Saudi Arabia, and very strong workforce also in Saudi Arabia. That's also part of infrastructure for our industry. 3,000 to 4,000 strong Saudi nationals working for us, out of which 800 female staff, girls working for us. They are punctual, very hardworking. So this type of infrastructure is developing in this part of the world, especially in Saudi Arabia. Economy is strong, visionary leadership, security. So this is a part of infrastructure in our industry. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ali. I would like to speak to you and ask you, so we were talking, I know you're running this mining operation now here in Saudi Arabia. How can industry be enabled by targeted infrastructure investments? And how will perhaps your particular business area turbocharge the global economy?
Turbocharge, that's a challenge. I'll come back to the end of that. I think what we're looking at is a form of private-public partnership, which is a little different. So the public-private partnership we traditionally think of is how the infrastructure gets funded and constructed. In a way, as an industry, we don't really care who funds it or how it gets done. We just need the infrastructure. So our public-private partnership is how do we as an industry get enabled by investment in infrastructure, typically by governments, however they want to fund that. And I think we're a textbook case. You know, Saudi Arabia has had resources known in the kingdom for a very long time, but never developed because of lack of infrastructure. In the last 10 years, we've invested through Ma'aden $25 billion in building a mining industry in bauxite, phosphate, gold and copper in the kingdom. That was all enabled by government investment in infrastructure, particularly a rail line, which has cost $5 billion. So we invested $25 billion from public and public debt and equity markets, and the $5 billion was done by the government investing in the rail. And that enabled an industry that just wouldn't have existed before. So I think understanding how government can enable industry, not just urbanization, is really important. And I think a couple of the challenges I see there for governments is one, you know, typically governments think on their annual budget. Everyone's worried about budget deficits, what's coming. Infrastructure thinks much longer term than that. And the second is understanding the real return on infrastructure. It's easy to say, well, there'll be these revenues coming in and these are the costs going out. If you look at our business, mining is a classic example of the opposite of urbanization. The minerals we mine and the metals, the location was decided millions of years ago.
Yeah.
We can't change those. So we have to deal with what's there. So we need the infrastructure to move around. The flip side to it being in remote areas is that when we invest there and create jobs there, the impact is super turbocharged, if you like, on those regions. You know, creating a job in Riyadh is great. Create a job in Taif in the north of the country, you have a transformative effect on the population. So when governments and investors, I mean, investors have a different perspective. When governments think about the funds they put into infrastructure, I think there needs to be a better way of capturing those greater social and economic goods beyond just the revenues that are generated from the industry or the GDP contribution. And again, to do that, I think you have to have a much longer term perspective. And I think Vision 2030 actually is an important part of that. I see that in a lot of the programs. These are not annual programs. There's actually a really well-structured, thought-out approach to this. So hopefully that will help us do our part to turbocharge.
Good. Mr. Wang, I haven't spoken to you yet. What would you say are the new cities and urban projects to be watching?
I think that is, I'm from the traditional sector, from the steel sector. This is I'm not so familiar with this investment area. But there is one tradition I can foresee is that, for example, the infrastructure is not only the traditional one, like the railway, like the road, and like the state grid, but also including some new trend, for example, the 5G internet work. So I think that is in 4G generation, then we connected all the terminals, I mean the people. In 5G, and we will internet all the things, internet everything. And for example, if we want to build, now there's a trend on the steel plant, we want to build smart steel plant. So we have a massive data should transfer. We need to make the equipment check themselves, operate themselves, and all this depends on this 5G internet. So this is, I think that is another infrastructure which is very important. For example, in China, for 4G, China total invest around 3.5 million base station. And for 5G, I think it's even much more than that. So then, I think this is basic for industrialization. So this is one thing. Second, I think another infrastructure which I think is maybe intangible, but is also very important, is the trust system. Because now if we come to the internet and we connect everything, we connect every person, then we need to, first is identify them. So then second, we need to check and give the certification or approve whether this connection is true, whether this resources is true. And also, if that we connect to the person, then we can also need to check whether we have this, we can give them the credit. So then that means now we are talking about blockchain. So this blockchain is, I think that is for all this system is the next round of investment for the infrastructure, which is intangible but very important. So that is my point of view.
Thank you. Ben, would you say that global investment structure will actually benefit communities by and large?
Yes.
Sorry. Oh, so, well, you can both discuss it.
Okay. Yes, I think that is infrastructure investment will benefit the community. This is very clear. And I think there is 3 dimensions. One is that is for the convenience. So everybody know if the traffic is connect to your town, then this is bring convenience to you. Second, I think is about the civilization. So once you have the state grid, then you have television. Even you are cannot approach to the high education, then but anyhow you can know what is the civilization is. And if you have internet, you can approach to the knowledge. So that is the second one, I think. The third one, I think, is they will bring the converting of the life, like 5G. I think that is if we trace back 10 years, no people in China, they can imagine that they go abroad, that go to shopping and without any currency, note and currency bring with them. And they can directly, by using your mobile phone to all the shoppings. So that I think that is what is the infrastructure investment shaping our community and shaping our life.
I think when we look at the big populations where we've seen big movements of people from living below the poverty line to being shifted above the poverty line and moving into the middle class, a cornerstone of those economies, whether it be China or India, has been the fact that you've seen a big investment in infrastructure, which has enabled those economies to be much more efficient, to be much more accessible. I think the really exciting thing is that as we're starting to see smart technology emerge, which is, I suppose, being sort of embedded into infrastructure, then a lot of communities are able to access technology that once required much more asset-heavy type of infrastructure investing. We're seeing that with renewable energy, we're seeing that with water treatment and water recycling, we're seeing that with the ways we can better fabricate from a construction point of view using 3D printing and other technologies to enable things to be built quicker, more effectively, and not necessarily and manufactured not necessarily in the direct area to where they're going to be used. So those sorts of changes are meaning that the price point of infrastructure, the investment price point, is being brought down, so it's more accessible to communities that perhaps couldn't afford it, but it's also much more nimble. And the really exciting, I suppose, byproduct of that is that if data is the new oil, then increasingly infrastructure is becoming very important in providing large reams and sources of data to be used from an analytics AI point of view. Because if you think about the amount of people that every day around the world are using roads or have access to water or use airports or rail networks, the amount of data that's being collected that hasn't really been mined or harnessed previously is really enriching to then the way that can be used both from a community point of view, from a consumer point of view, but also to make infrastructure much smarter.
Thank you. That's very interesting points. Mr. Ali,
Yes.
if you were an investor here in Saudi Arabia and the GCC, and I know you are, what would you like to see happen in terms of infrastructure?
See, now during these 2-3 years, I'm seeing that Saudi Arabia infrastructure, they are investing a lot. Government is also investing. PPP project, what my distinguished co-panelist mentioned, PPP project is also in the future, it will come. So, one-tier city, two-tier city, all the infrastructure development is coming. See, also here we are focusing, here Saudi Arabia, they are focusing the infrastructure in the agricultural field. That's also very important. When we talk about infrastructure, not only roads, bridges, and airport, and seaport, and rail, agricultural infrastructure is also very important. How the water, how we will prevent the pollution, etc. That's also part of infrastructure. So I'm a food industrialist, so we want also good infrastructure in the industrial field. In the agricultural field, also in the industrial field. So in Saudi Arabia, as an investor, this is a very right time the investors from all over the world to invest in Saudi Arabia, number one. Number two, the government is focusing in the infrastructure, not only in roads, bridges, other infrastructure, then also in the agriculture infrastructure. Agriculture, they are giving big thrust in the agricultural field. So I'm very happy to invest in this great country.
Good. So I've got one more question left, and then we're going to wrap up. I'd like to direct it to you. So as you're also here from Saudi Arabia and the Mining Group, how much investment have you actually needed, or are you still needing for Mada? I mean, mining is a notoriously sort of expensive business and requires a lot of bolt-on infrastructure as well. How short are you still, or what are your ambitions here?
Not a great deal more, actually, because when you build something like a railway, that enables you for 50 or 100 years. So once you've spent that, the incremental investment in increasing capacity, for example, is relatively limited. So actually a lot of the big heavy lifting's been done, and now it's more basic things. And I think we didn't really touch on it here, but the softer infrastructure. So I think, where there's a big opportunity here is in health and in education. If you look there, again, that becomes a more difficult one again to assess economically, but the impact's enormous. So we've, as an industrial, commercial, listed company, have had to invest in education in the north of the country because the infrastructure there has just not been very good. But you look at the impact on the community, it's amazing. You see the transformation of people's attitudes, the young people, you know, they're ambitious for jobs that they didn't exist before, and relatively small investments as well. So I think that softer part of infrastructure, which we didn't touch on much, I think actually is something we shouldn't forget, and actually that's one of the biggest opportunities in Saudi Arabia, I think. It's also one of the hardest ones to, I think, execute because the jobs are large, and again, the immediate economic return is not one that you can easily measure.
So this reinvestment back into the communities at source
Absolutely.
is really what you're advocating for,
Yeah.
that has proven to be the most
And we've done that
effective way.
in cooperation with the government. So we've invested in schools of excellence, we've built a mining polytechnic, all with government agencies. So we've kind of done the execution and the initial funding and then handing it over to the government over time. That's just our contribution. I think a much bigger program is needed across the country. But that's the opportunity. I mean, I was listening to what Mr. Ali was saying, and I think Ben was mentioning as well. If you think about the big advantage a lot of the Western developed countries have is embedded infrastructure. It's been there for a very long time. People complain about, oh, it's not very modern, it's not as great. But compared to a developing country, not having that infrastructure is a really big disadvantage. However, there is a great opportunity, and I think a country like Saudi Arabia is better positioned than most. When you're building infrastructure, you can now build infrastructure with the future in mind. So you embed all your digital technology. When you build a school nowadays, it's not a school like you would have built in 1950. So you're building the new infrastructure, I think, in Saudi Arabia actually will allow the country to leapfrog if it has that long-term plan, which I think Vision 2030 is trying to do.
Okay. All right. Well, on that note, I will call it quits here. Thank you very much for my panel, for attending, for your patience and for your great answers. I enjoyed them very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.